At 10:15 in the morning on April 9, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokryshkin climbed into the cockpit of his P-39 airacobra at a forward air base near Krymskaya in southern Russia, preparing for his first combat victory in an aircraft that would prove everyone wrong. The fighter was American-built, shipped across 2 oceans, despised by British pilots, rejected by American squadrons, and written off as worthless by nearly every Western Air Force that tried to fly it. 24 hours earlier, Pokryshkin's commanding officer had told him the new fighters would arrive soon. Lend-lease shipments from the United States. The British had tested them and refused to keep them. The Americans used them briefly in the Pacific and were already replacing them with better aircraft. Now these hand-me-downs were being shipped to Russia, and Soviet pilots were expected to fly them against the Luftwaffe. Pokin had been flying the Yak-1 and MiG-3 for 2 years. Both were solid Soviet designs. Both could fight German messes and hold their own in combat, but both had problems. Radios that barely worked, guns that jammed, engines that quit at the worst possible times. The new American fighter, the P-39, had a reputation T had preceded it. British pilots called it a death trap. American pilots in New Guinea said it couldn't climb, couldn't turn with a zero, couldn't intercept bombers above 15,000 feet. One American joke in the Pacific went that a P-400, the export model, was just a P-39 with a zero on its tail. The aircraft had one fatal design flaw that killed its prospects in Western Air Forces. During development in 1938, the prototype had been equipped with a turbocharger that allowed excellent performance at high altitude. The XP-39 first flew on April 6, 1938, achieving 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, and reaching that altitude in only 5 minutes. But in June 1939, the Army Aurora ordered the prototype to narrow wind tunnels to reduce drag and increase speed. Engineers found the turbocharger installation created excessive drag. In August 1939, Bell Aircraft proposed removing the turbocharger entirely, replacing it with a simple single-stage, single-speed supercharger. That decision destroyed the P-39's high-altitude capability. Above 15,000 feet, the engine choked for air. Performance dropped catastrophically. By 20,000 feet, the fighter was helpless. For American and British Air Forces planning to escort bombers at 25,000 feet or higher, this was unacceptable. RAF pilots tested the P-400 in late 1941 and immediately rejected it. They reported the aircraft was inferior to the Spitfire and Hurricane at meaningful combat altitudes. Worse, it had a dangerous tendency to enter flat spins with little warning. The center of gravity was too far back because the engine sat behind the pilot. Once the 37mm nose cannon fired and emptied its ammunition, the aircraft became tail-heavy. Several British pilots nearly died in test flights when their airacobras entered spins they could barely recover from. The Americans fared no better. In early 1942, P-39s and P-400s deployed to defend against the Japanese advance across the Pacific. Squadrons flew them at Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and throughout New Guinea. Pilots discovered immediately what the British already knew. The P-39 couldn't intercept Japanese bombers flying at 20,000 feet. It couldn't climb fast enough to reach them. When it did reach altitude, it had no power left to fight. American pilots reported the aircraft felt mushy above 15,000 feet, like flying through mud. Control responses were sluggish, speed dropped. Japanese Zeros could run circles around, ending them at altitude. Lieutenant Evan Stevens flew P-39s with the 39th Fighter Squadron in New Guinea. He later described the frustration. The aircraft looked impressive with its nose-mounted cannon and sleek design, but it simply couldn't do what Pacific combat demanded. In one engagement overlay in April 1942, Stevens's flight scrambled to intercept a Japanese raid. They climbed hard, pushing the Allison engines to maximum power. By the time they reached 15,000 feet, they could see the enemy bombers 5,000 feet above them. The P-39 struggled to gain more altitude. Their rate of climb had dropped to almost nothing. The Zeros saw them coming and dove down to engage. Stevens' wingman got caught in a turning fight at 18,000 feet. The P-39 wallowed through the turn. The Zero reversed and got guns on him. Stevens watched his wingman's aircraft trailing smoke as it went down. The problems weren't limited to altitude performance. The 37mm M4 cannon mounted in the nose and firing through the propeller hub seemed like devastating firepower on paper. In practice, it jammed constantly. The cannon's slow rate of fire, only 3 rounds per second, combined with the heavy shell's arcing trajectory, mad. Hitting maneuvering targets nearly impossible. Pilots reported the cannon would fire 2 or 3 rounds and then jam, leaving them with only the machine guns. Some missions saw P-39s taking off with completely non-functional nose cannons because maintenance crews couldn't keep them working in the jungle conditions. The wing-mounted 30 caliber machine guns were too light to damage Japanese aircraft effectively. Only the 250 caliber guns in the nose had real stopping power. But 2 guns weren't enough. By the end of 1942, American pilots in the Pacific were calling the P-39 the Iron Dog. They requested transfers to P-38 squadrons as soon as possible. The 5th Air Force had claimed about 80 Japanese aircraft destroyed by December, but had lost a similar number of 39 PSOs. The kill ratio was 1 at best. For an Air Force that needed to achieve air superiority against veteran Japanese pilots, that wasn't good enough. The only American pilot to become an ace flying the P-39 was Second Lieutenant William Fiedler. Between January and June 1943, Fiedler shot down 5 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. His 3rd victory came on June 12 when he downed a Zero 10 miles from Cape Esperance. 4 days later, when 380 escorted 50 Val dive bombers toward American transports off Guadalcanal, Fiedler shot down 2 Vals to become the only P-39 ace in American service. 2 weeks later, on June 30, 1943, Fiedler was killed on the ground when a P-38 Lightning, suffering from engine failure during takeoff, crashed into his parked P-39 while he sat in the cockpit. Both aircraft exploded. Fiedler was pulled from the burning wreckage unconscious and died shortly after. He never got to enjoy his unique place in American aviation history. His death seemed to summarize the P-39's reputation with American forces. Even the aircraft's sole ace died because of it, killed not by the enemy, but by an accident that wouldn't have happened if he'd been flying a different fighter. By mid-1943, the Army Air Force was phasing out 39 PSOs as quickly as replacement aircraft arrived. P-38's 47 PSOs and P-51 seconds were taking over frontline duties. The remaining P-39s were relegated to training units or sent to secondary theaters. The fighter had failed in every role the Americans needed it to perform. This is where the story should have ended. A promising design ruined by a critical engineering decision. Rejected by the forces that ordered it, relegated to history as a cautionary tale about removing essential components to save weight. Except in Russia, something different happened. The air war on the Eastern Front wasn't fought at high altitude. When the first P-400s arrived in Murman via Arctic convoy in late 1941, Soviet pilots approached them with low expectations. They'd heard the aircraft were rejects, hand-me-downs the British didn't want. The first test flights confirmed the warnings about spin characteristics. Soviet test pilots deliberately tried to reproduce the flat spin problem and succeeded immediately. The aircraft would snap into a vicious flat spin with almost no warning if flown with an empty nose ammunition bay. The demonstration shocked American observers who couldn't reproduce the spin back in the United States. But Soviet pilots noticed something else during those test flights. Below 15,000 feet, the P-39 performed beautifully. The Allison engine produced strong power at low and medium altitudes. The aircraft was faster than most Soviet fighters below 12,000 feet. It rolled crisply, turned tightly, and had excellent visibility from the bubble canopy. Most importantly, it had something Soviet fighters desperately lacked: a reliable radio. The SCR 522 radio system in the P-39 was clear, powerful, and worked consistently. Soviet pilots could communicate with each other in flight, coordinate attacks, warn of threats, and maintain formation discipline. This was revolutionary for the WWII, where most fighters either had no radio or radios that barely worked. Pilots could hear each other clearly as if talking on a telephone next to each other, share information in real time about enemy positions and tactical situations, coordinate tactics, and never be caught by surprise again. The firepower was substantial. The 37mm cannon, while temperamental for Americans, worked better for Soviet maintenance crews, who prioritized keeping guns functional. The M4 cannon fired a heavy shell that could destroy enemy aircraft with a single hit. While the slow rate of fire, only 3 rounds per second, frustrated American pilots trying to hit maneuvering targets, Soviet pilots adapted their tactics. They trained to close to shorter ranges before firing, increasing hit probability. They learned the precise lead angles needed for the cannon's trajectory. They practiced until the weapon's quirks became predictable and manageable. The 2 nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns were synchronized to fire through the propeller. These weapons had a higher rate of fire than the cannon and were easier to aim. Soviet pilots often used the machine guns to walk fire onto targets, then finished with the cannon once their aim was precise. Combined with the cannon, this gave the P-39 the heaviest forward-firing armament of any Soviet fighter. Domestic Soviet fighters typically mounted 1 or 2 cannon plus machine guns, but the P-39's combination of large-caliber cannon and heavy machine guns was uniquely destructive. Soviet pilots immediately began removing the wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns to save weight and improve roll rate. These outboard weapons added approximately 60% lb, including ammunition. Removing them shifted the aircraft's center of gravity slightly forward, improving stability. More importantly, reducing wing weight decreased rotational inertia, allowing faster roll rates. With the wing guns gone, the aircraft became lighter, more maneuverable, and easier to maintain. The modification worked perfectly. Soviet pilot Nikolai Golodnikov recalled, "We immediately removed the wing machine guns, leaving 1 cannon and 2 machine guns. That modification improved roll rate by reducing rotational inertia. The cockpit was very comfortable, and visibility was outstanding. The instrument panel was very ergonomic with the entire complement of instruments right up to an artificial horizon and radio compass. Soviet mechanics also modified other systems based on pilot feedback. Some units adjusted controlled cable tensions to improve responsiveness. Others modified the oxygen system for better high-altitude performance, though this was less critical given the typical combat altitudes. The fuel system received attention to improve cold weather, starting essential for operations in Russian winters. These field modifications, while minor individually, collectively improved the aircraft's suitability for Eastern Front conditions. The contrast with American maintenance practices was stark. American mechanics worked under strict technical order compliance. Modifications required engineering approval through official channels. Field expedient solutions were discouraged or forbidden. This rigidity made sense for aircraft operating long-established bases with full supply chains, but it prevented the kind of adaptive optimization that Soviet units achieved in field conditions. Soviet mechanics had more autonomy to make changes based on operational experience. Their modifications weren't always documented or officially approved, but they worked. And most critically, the tactical environment on the Eastern Front played to every one of the P-39's strengths, while avoiding its weaknesses. German and Soviet air combat in 1943 happened predominantly between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Ground attack aircraft operated at low level. Fighters providing cover flew at medium altitudes. The massive tank battles and artillery duels that characterized Eastern Front warfare meant aircraft spent most of their time supporting ground operations at altitudes where the P-39 excelled. Unlike the Pacific or Europe, where bombers attacked from 20,000 feet or higher, German bombers on the Eastern Front typically operated below 15,000 feet when attacking Soviet positions. Stuka-style bombers came down low. J-88 level bombers rarely flew above 12,000 feet over the battlefield. Fighters escorting them stayed at similar altitudes. This meant Soviet P-39 Pilo. TIAs could fight at the exact altitude band where their aircraft performed best. Between 8,000 and 15,000 feet, the P-39 could outrun early Merced Bf-109 models, match the later ones, and hold its own against everything except the newest FW-19Os. The sturdy construction meant it could take battle damage and keep flying. The armor protection around the pilot was thick and effective. Soviet pilots quickly fell in love with the aircraft they nicknamed Kobushka, Dear Little Cobra or Kobrastoska, a blend of cobra and lastoska, meaning swallow. The affection was genuine. Getting these aircraft to the Soviet Union was itself an epic journey. P-39's destined for Russia began at Bell Aircraft's factory in Wheatfield, New York. From there they flew to Great Falls, Montana. Female pilots from the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, often flew this leg, fingers across the American continent. At Great Falls, male American pilots took over, flying the fighters northwest to Fairbanks or Nome, Alaska. This was already a challenging route, crossing thousands of miles of wilderness. But the truly dangerous part came next. At Alaskan airfields, American pilots turned the aircraft over to Soviet Pilo. TIAs who would fly them across the Bering Sea to Siberia. This Alaska-Siberia route, called Alib, was one of the most unusual and dangerous supply lines of the war. Soviet pilots flew single-seat fighters in groups accompanied by twin-engine bombers or transports that provided navigation and safety watch. They crossed vast stretches of open ocean where a single engine failure meant death in freezing water. Weather was brutal, storms could appear without warning. Navigation was difficult with few landmarks over water and ice. Many pilots were lost on this route, disappearing into the Arctic without a trace. Those who made it landed at airfields in eastern Siberia, where the aircraft were inspected, serviced, and prepared for the next leg. From there, T-39s flew west across Siberia Torn, then on to staging areas near the front lines. The journey from New York to a Soviet fighter regiment could take weeks and covered over 7,000 meters. Every P-39 that reached Soviet squadrons had already survived an incredible journey. Alexander Pokryshkin became the champion of the P-39 in Soviet service. By early 1943, he had already scored nearly 20 victories flying MiG-32s and Yak-11s. He was aggressive, analytical, and constantly studying tactics to gain advantages over German pilots. When his regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, converted to P-39 Ace in January 1943, Pokryshkin threw himself into mastering the new aircraft. He spent weeks training in the rear, studying the fighter's characteristics, learning its strengths and limitations. He developed new tactics specifically designed around the P-39's capabilities. One innovation was the bookshelf formation. Pokryshkin arranged his fighters in stacked layers at different altitudes, each layer covering the one below, each with specific tasks. If an enemy tried to escape the first layer, the second layer intercepted. If the second layer engaged, the third provided cover. The formation required precise coordination and communication. Only the P-39's excellent radio made it possible. Pushkin also pioneered the use of ground-based radar coordination. The 4th Air Army received its first mobile radar stations in the summer of 1942. Pokryshkin worked with radar controllers to develop intercept procedures using radio to guide fighters toward German formations before visual contact. The system worked brilliantly, allowing Soviet F-fighters to ambush German aircraft with perfect positioning. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin flew his first combat mission in a P-39. 8 airacobras intercepted a German formation over Krimskaya. Misses it 109 feet, attacking Soviet lag 3 seconds. Pokryshkin rolled in from altitude, selected a Bf-109 and opened fire with all weapons. The 37mm cannon shells walked up the fuselage. The Messerschmitt's engine exploded. Pieces flew off. The fighter rolled inverted and fell, trailing black smoke. First kill in a P-39. 3 days later, on April 12, Pokryshkin shot down 4 Messerschmitt 109 seconds in a single engagement over Iran. He used the bookshelf formation, coordinating attacks with his flight, using the P-39's radio to direct each pilot into position. The German fighters tried to reverse and counter, but the Soviet formation adapted instantly. Pokryshkin's flight maintained altitude advantage, dictated engagement terms, and shot down 4 enemy aircraft without loss. Between April 9 and April 30, 1943, Pokryshkin claimed 12 victories flying the P-39. Other pilots in his regiment were achieving similar success. The tactics were spreading. The results were undeniable. On April 29, 1943, one of the most famous engagements occurred. 8 P-39 airacobras, one piloted by Pokryshkin, were directed by ground control toward a large German formation. 3 full squadrons of Junkers J-87 Stuka dive bombers were being escorted by a Geschwader of Bf-10-9s. The Soviets attacked from the Sunday. A pair of 39 Psois engaged the fighters while the remaining 6 dove through the bomber formation, repeating the attack multiple times. The engagement lasted minutes, but the results were devastating for the Germans. 12 German aircraft were shot down. Pokryshkin claimed 5 kills himself. Not a single Soviet aircraft was lost. This was the kind of success Soviet pilots had rarely achieved earlier in the war. On May 24, 1943, Pokryshkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award. By June, he was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. He exchanged his P-39K1 model for a new P-39N, aircraft number 100, marked with white numerals. He would fly this aircraft for the rest of the war. The Germans noticed something had changed. Luftwaffe pilots on the Eastern Front began reporting in mid-1943 that Soviet fighters were performing differently, more aggressive, better coordinated, harder to surprise. Intelligence reports mentioned American-built fighters with heavy nose armament, fast at low altitude, and always operating in coordinated groups with excellent radio discipline. Grigory Rakalov, flying as Pokryshkin's wingman in the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, became another P-39 expert. Rakalov had an unusual backstory. He suffered from color blindness, which should have disqualified him from flying. He hid his condition throughout training and the early war. On July 26, 1941, during a combat sortie, Rakov's I-16 was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He was wounded in the right leg, but managed to land his damaged aircraft. Surgeons saved the leg, but Rechkov spent months recovering. He returned to duty in April 1942 and continued flying despite his color vision deficiency. Rechkov had started the war flying I-16s and I-153 seconds, achieving modest success. When the regiment converted to P-39s, Rakolov found his stride. The aircraft matched his aggressive flying style perfectly. By the end of 1942, Rechkov had 4 solo victories and 2 shared. By May 1943, after 2 months flying the P-39 in combat over the Kuban, he had 12 solo victories and 2 shared. The aircraft transformed his effectiveness as a fighter pilot. On May 24, 1943, the same day Pokryshkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award, Rakolov received his as well. Both men flew P-39s. Both would score the majority of their wartime victories in American-built fighters. Rechkov eventually scored 44 of his 56 victories flying P-39s. Most of these victories came in 2 specific aircraft that he flew for extended periods. P-390 serial number 42-8747 and P-39Q-15 serial number 44 to 2547. He marked both aircraft with his initials RGA on the tail. Soviet mechanics maintained them meticulously. Akolov developed a personal connection with these aircraft, knew their quirks, trusted their reliability, and pushed them to their limits in combat. He survived being shot down, wounded multiple times, and involved in one catastrophic engagement, on May 31, 1944, where 5 P-39s were lost after he pursued enemy fighters alone, rather than maintaining formation discipline. Yet, he kept flying the airacobra, kept scoring victories, and kept proving that the aircraft Americans had rejected could dominate in the right hands and the right tactical environment. By June 1943, several other Soviet pilots were achieving remarkable success. P-39s. Nikolai Gulev scored 32 of his 57 victories in aerobas. Gulev was known for his aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship. He preferred to close to very short range before firing, maximizing the effectiveness of the P-39's concentrated firepower. His approach was risky but devastatingly effective. Gulev received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award twice and survived the war despite being shot down multiple times. Dmitry Glinker scored 50 victories with the vast majority in P-39s. Glinker flew in the 100th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment and was known for his methodical approach to combat. Unlike some aces who relied on instinct and aggression, Glinker studied his opponents carefully, looking for patterns and weaknesses. He kept detailed notes on German tactics and shared his observations with other pilots. His analytical approach complemented Pokryshkin's tactical innovations perfectly. Glinker was eventually seriously wounded on July 15, 1944, when he bailed out of his badly damaged airacobra and struck its tailplane during ejection. He survived but required months of recovery. Alexander Klubb scored 31 of his 50 victories in American fighters. Klubb was one of the pilots who participated in the May 31, 1944 engagement, where Rekolov's formation lost 5 aircraft. Despite that disaster, Klubb continued flying P-39s and achieved consistent success throughout 1944. His experience demonstrated that even in difficult engagements against newer German fighters, skilled pilots in P-39s could survive and prevail. Another notable P-39 pilot was Ivan Babak, who scored 33 victories, most in airacobras. Babak was known for his exceptional eyesight and ability to spot enemy aircraft before his wingmen. This skill, combined with the P-39's radio, made him an invaluable early warning asset for his formation. Babak would spot German fighters at extreme range, report their position via radio, and guide his formation into optimal attack positions. His contributions went far beyond his personal kill count. The pattern was clear. Half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces scored the majority of their victories flying P-39s. This wasn't a small sample size or statistical anomaly. It represented a fundamental reality about the aircraft's effectiveness in Soviet service. This wasn't coincidence. This was the systematic result of matching aircraft capabilities to mission requirements. The Soviets received 4,719 P-39s through Lend-Lease, accounting for more than one-third of all American and British supplied fighters in Soviet service. Nearly half of all P-39 production went to Russia. These aircraft were flown hard, maintained under difficult conditions, and used in constant combat. Soviet-era Cobra losses totaled 1,030 aircraft between 1942 and 1945. 49 lost in 1942, 305 in 1943, 486 in 1944, 190 in 1945. The loss rate increased as the war intensified and Soviet forces pushed westward, facing more concentrated Luftwaffe resistance and newer German fighters, like the FW-190 and late-model Bf-10-9s. But the victories increased even faster. By mid-1943, the kill ratio for Soviet P-39 units was positive. They were destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This reversed the typical exchange rate early in the war, when Soviet fighters often traded 1-for-1 or worse with the Luftwaffe. German pilots began to recognize and fear certain Soviet formations. When Pokryshkin's unit was transferred to operations in Ukraine, Luftwaffe radio operators would warn their pilots when he was in the air. Pokryshkin used the radio call Sigam, meaning 100 per number painted, on his aircraft. German pilots learned that hearing Sotka meant Pokryshkin was airborne. Some Luftwaffe units were ordered to stay on the ground when radio intelligence confirmed he was flying. This was unprecedented. A single Soviet pilot in an American fighter that had been rejected by Western air forces was causing the Luftwaffe to avoid combat. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front between mid-1943 and late 1944 show a consistent pattern. Luftwaffe pilots reported increasing difficulty achieving favorable engagement outcomes against Soviet fighters. The reports specifically mentioned American-built aircraft with distinctive profiles and aggressive coordinated tactics. German intelligence officers tried to determine what had changed. They examined crashed P-39s recovered from Soviet territory and found the modifications Soviet mechanics had made. Removed wing guns, adjusted control systems, modified radios. But German analysts couldn't understand how these minor changes produced such significant tactical advantages. The real advantage wasn't in the modifications themselves, but in what they represented. Soviet pilots and mechanics working together to optimize aircraft or their specific mission requirements. This kind of fieldal innovation was rare in the rigidly hierarchical Luftwaffe, where modifications required engineering approval from Germany. Soviet units could test changes, evaluate results, and implement improvements within days. German units needed weeks or months for similar processes. German tactical responses evolved throughout late 1943 and 1944. Some pilots tried to avoid engagement with P-39 formations entirely, waiting for opportunities to catch isolated Soviet fighters. This defensive posture contradicted earlier Luftwaffe doctrine and reduced German effectiveness. Other pilots tried more aggressive tactics, closing quickly to negate the Soviets' coordination advantages. But aggression without corresponding performance advantages just meant dying faster. Several experienced Luftwaffe aces were killed in 1944, trying tactics that had worked perfectly in 1942 against less capable Soviet fighters. The psychological impact was significant. For nearly 2 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated Soviet skies. German pilots flew with confidence, knowing their aircraft were superior and their tactics proven. That confidence was eroding. And ace pilots who had scored dozens of victories were being shot down by Soviet pilots in American fighters. The tactics that had worked reliably for 2 years were suddenly failing. The reasons were hard for German intelligence to pinpoint. The aircraft looked the same as the ones Americans flew. The engines were identical. The armament was similar, but Soviet pilots flew them differently, coordinated better, and seemed to always have information advantages. What the Germans couldn't see were the subtle modifications Soviet mechanics made and the tactical innovations Soviet pilots developed. The removed wing guns that improved roll rate, the radio discipline that prevented surprises, the ground radar coordination that positioned Soviet fighters perfectly for ambushes, the stacked altitude formations that gave Soviet pilots multiple chances to engage, the aggressive training that emphasized teamwork over individual glory. All of these factors combined to make the P-39 in Soviet hands a completely different weapon than what Americans or British had fielded. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters to 39 pesos at rates unseen earlier in the war. veteran German pilots who had achieved numerous victories against Soviet aircraft were being shot down by airacobras. On September 21, 1943, Pokryshkin shot down 3 J-88 bombers in a single pass at low altitude. The engagement was witnessed by many Soviet ground troops and journalists, further spreading his fame. The feat was remarkable not just for the number of kills, but because it demonstrated the P-39's effectiveness against multiple targets in rapid succession. Throughout the autumn of 1943, Soviet P-39 units continued their success. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, equipped entirely with airacobras, became one of the most feared Soviet units on the Eastern Front. German pilots learned to identify the distinctive sound of the Allison engine and the appearance of Soviet airacobras in formation. Unlike earlier in the war, when Soviet fighters operated individually or in loose pairs, P-39 units flew in tight coordinated formations with constant radio communication. The tactical innovations continued to evolve. Soviet pilots developed the pendulum patrol pattern, where fighters would fly in overlapping elliptical paths rather than straight lines. This maintained speed, prevented ambush, and ensured continuous coverage of assigned airspace. The pattern was impossible without reliable radios and well-trained pilots who could maintain formation discipline. Both requirements were met by Soviet P-39 units. The kill ratios tell the story. In 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed Soviet aircraft at rates of 5:1 or higher. By early 1942, the ratio had improved to 3:1 in Germany's favor. By late 1943, after P-39s had been in Soviet service for a year, the ratio approached 1:1. In some engagements, Soviet P-39 units achieved positive kill ratios, destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This represented a fundamental shift in the air war over the Eastern Front. This wasn't because German pilots had become less skilled. The Luftwaffe was still one of the most professional air forces in the world. But they were facing Soviet pilots in aircraft that finally matched their equipment with radios that allowed coordination, with training that emphasized teamwork and tactics, and with firepower that could destroy German fighters with a single burst. The P-39 gave Soviet pilots the tools they needed. Everything else, the tactics, the aggression, the determination, had always been there. Now they had an aircraft that could execute their plans. American pilots in the Pacific and European theaters never saw this potential. They flew P-39s in environments that exposed every weakness while offering no way to leverage the aircraft's strengths. High-altitude bomber escort required performance the P-39 didn't have. Pacific island hopping required range the P-39 couldn't provide. Fighting agile Japanese Zeros at altitude meant operating where the P-39 was at its worst. In those contexts, failure was inevitable. The contrast in tactical approaches was stark. American fighter doctrine in the Pacific emphasized individual initiative and aggressive pursuit of targets. Pilots were trained to engage when opportunities appeared and to press attacks until the enemy was destroyed or escaped. This worked well in aircraft like the P-38 or P-47, which had the performance margins to recover from mistakes. In the P-39, operating at the edge of its performance envelope, aggressive individual action often led to disaster. Pilots who chased targets into unfavorable positions found themselves unable to disengage when threatened. Soviet fighter doctrine evolved in the opposite direction during the war. Early Soviet tactics emphasized mass attacks with limited coordination. Individual pilots had little initiative and were expected to follow formation leaders rigidly. This approach failed catastrophically in 1941 and 1942. By 1943, Soviet doctrine had transformed. Pilots were trained to operate in coordinated pairs and flights with constant radio communication. Individual initiative was encouraged within the framework of formation discipline. Pilots could adjust tactics based on immediate situations while maintaining overall coordination with wingmen and flight leaders. This doctrinal evolution aligned perfectly with the P-39's capabilities. The aircraft's excellent radio made coordination natural and effective. Its performance characteristics rewarded formation discipline rather than individual aggressive pursuit. Its firepower meant coordinated attacks could destroy targets quickly without extended engagements. Soviet pilots adapted their tactics to the aircraft, while American pilots tried to adapt the aircraft to their tactics. One approach succeeded, the other failed. The difference extended to maintenance and technical support. Soviet mechanics working under difficult field conditions (PR) prioritized weapon reliability and radio functionality. They removed equipment they considered unnecessary like wing guns and some armor plating to improve performance in areas they valued. American mechanics, following technical orders, strictly maintained aircraft to factory specifications even when those specifications didn't match operational needs. Soviet pilots had direct input into how their aircraft were configured. American pilots had little say in modifications. In the Soviet context, everything aligned perfectly: medium and low altitude combat, coordinated group tactics enabled by reliable radios, ground support missions requiring sturdy construction and good visibility, interception of German bombers operating at similar altitudes. The P-39 wasn't transformed by Soviet use, it was simply used correctly for the first time. Pokryshkin ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, 47 scored in P-39s. This made him the second highest scoring Soviet ace and the highest scoring ace flying any American-designed aircraft. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award 3 times on May 24, 1943, August 24, 1943, and August 19, 1944. He also received 4 Orders of Lenin, the Order of the October Revolution, 4 Orders of the Red Banner, 2 Orders of Subaru Second Class, 2 Orders of the Red Star, and the American Distinguished Service Medal. After the war, Pokryshkin continued serving in the Soviet Air Force, eventually reaching the rank of Marshal of Aviation. He retired in 1981 and died November 13, 1985, at age 72. He never changed his opinion that the P-39 was an excellent fighter when used correctly. Several times during the war, directives from Moscow requested his units consider switching to Soviet-built aircraft such as the L-5 or Yak fighters. Pokryshkin turned down these requests each time, preferring to keep his American fighters. Ekolov scored 56 confirmed victories and 6 shared. He flew 452 combat sorties and engaged in 122 dogfights during the war. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award twice, on May 24, 1943 and July 1, 1944. After the war, he graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1951, commanded various regiments and air divisions, and became Deputy Commander of Fighter Aircraft for the Far Eastern Air Defense Army in 1957. He reached the rank of Major General of Aviation in 1959 before retiring. He wrote 2 books about his experiences. He died December 20, 1990 at age 70. Lieutenant William Fiedler, the only American P-39 ace, is buried in a cemetery in Ohio. His service record notes 5 victories in the P-39 between January and June 1943. No American pilot surpassed that total in the aircraft. The contrast couldn't be starker. 1 American ace, dozens of Soviet aces. The difference wasn't pilot skill. American pilots were well-trained, aggressive, and capable. The difference was mission requirements and tactical environment. The story of the P-39 is about context. Bell Aircraft built it as a high-altitude interceptor for defending the American coast. When the turbocharger was removed, it became a medium-altitude fighter. Western air forces tried to use it as a high-altitude fighter anyway, and it failed. Soviet air forces tested it as a medium-altitude fighter, and it succeeded spectacularly. The aircraft didn't change. The application changed. On May 9, 1945, Soviet Captain Vasily Pshenichikov flying an airacobra shot down a German Fowler-Wolf FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft over Prague. This was the last aerial victory of World War II in Europe. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The P-39 that West RN Air Forces had written off scored the final kill of the European war. That same day, a German Mi-262 jet fighter shot down a P-39 over Bohemia, marking the last Luftwaffe victory of the war. The airacobra was there at the beginning of Lend-Lease operations to Russia and there at the very end of the war. Soviet airacobras continued flying until 1949, when the last operational regiments retired the type and converted to jet fighters. The aircraft served longer in Soviet service than in American or British service and achieved far more success. American military analysts after the war studied Soviet use of P-39s and found the results difficult to accept. Some reports suggested Soviets used different tactics. Others proposed that German fighters on the Eastern Front were inferior to those in the West. German records disproved this. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. The P-39 succeeded in Soviet service because it was used correctly. Mission requirements determined success, not inherent aircraft quality. Post-war interviews with Soviet pilots consistently praised the P-39. Rechkov stated in a 1950s interview, "Of course, our fighters quickly caught up with the German Air Force." But aircraft like the P-39Q were well balanced for air combat. The most important advantage, in my opinion, was the high-sensitivity radio. The radio on the airacobra was able to communicate with flightmates in any situation as if they were talking on the phone next to each other. Other Soviet pilots echoed these sentiments. The radio, more than any other single feature, transformed Soviet fighter operations. The comparison with Soviet domestic fighters was telling. The Yak series fighters were lighter and more agile than P-39s. The LA-5 and L-7 had better climb rates and similar speed, but none matched the P-39's combination of firepower, radio reliability, sturdy construction, and pilot protection. Soviet pilots who flew both types generally preferred the American fighter for these reasons. The few Soviet aces who scored more victories in domestic fighters than P-39s like Ivan Kazidov, with 62 victories primarily in lease and Lasans, were exceptions that proved the rule about the P-39's effectiveness. Today the P-39 airacobra is remembered primarily as a failure in Western aviation history. Museums display them with explanations about rejection by American forces, aviation enthusiasts. Know it as the fighter nobody wanted. Books about World War II aircraft often dismiss it in a few paragraphs focused on its shortcomings. What those accounts rarely convey is the full story. Over 4,000 Soviet pilots flew P-39s in combat. They achieved approximately 3,000 individual victories based on Soviet claims adjusted for known overrounding. They developed innovative tactics that changed air warfare on the Eastern Front. They proved that understanding your tools and using them appropriately matters more than having theoretically superior equipment used inappropriately. The lessons extend beyond aviation. Organizations often reject tools or methods that fail in one context, never considering they might excel in another. The assumption that failure in one application means universal failure is common and often wrong. The P-39 failed for Americans and British because they needed something it couldn't provide. It succeeded for Soviets because they needed exactly what it could provide. Both outcomes were predictable based on mission requirements and tactical environments. Soviet pilots who flew P-39s considered them excellent fighters, perfectly suited to their missions. When you've scored 47 victories in an aircraft, when that aircraft's radio coordination saved your life repeatedly, when that aircraft's cannon destroyed enemy fighters with single bursts, you don't see a reject, you see a tool that worked exactly as needed. That was the P-39's reality in Soviet service. a fighter that gave Soviet pilots technological power with the Luftwaffe, heavy firepower, reliable communications, and sturdy construction. These advantages, combined with Soviet tactical innovations and pilot skill, achieved air superiority over the Eastern Front. The story matters because it's about more than one aircraft. It's about the importance of matching capabilities to requirements, about not dismissing tools that failed in one context without considering other contexts, about understanding that different tactical environments demand different solutions. The P-39 taught these lessons. American and British forces learned them through frustration and failure. Soviet forces learned them through testing and success. The aircraft remained constant. The difference was everything around it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Nos ayuda a compartir más historias olvidadas de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Suscríbete para mantenerte al tanto de estas historias desconocidas. Cada una importa. Cada una merece ser recordada y nos encantaría saber de ti. Deja un comentario abajo diciéndonos desde dónde nos ves. Nuestra comunidad se extiende desde Texas hasta Tasmania. Desde veteranos hasta aficionados a la historia, todos forman parte de algo especial aquí. Gracias por vernos y gracias por preservar estas historias.